when the same seed tells 4 different stories. Picture a farmer walking across his field in the early morning light, his weathered hands casting seeds with practiced rhythm. The sun catches each grain as it arcs through the air, and you can almost hear the gentle whisper as they settle onto various patches of ground. Some bounce off the hardened path with tiny clicks, others nestle into rocky crevices, many disappear among thorny undergrowth, and a precious few find their way to dark, prepared earth. This scene unfolds in Matthew 13, where Jesus paints an agricultural picture that every person in his farming community would recognize instantly. Yet something about his telling suggests these aren't just random farming observations. There's a mystery hidden in this everyday occurrence that could transform how we understand the most fundamental spiritual realities. We know this story well. A sower goes out to sow, and the seed falls on 4 different types of soil with dramatically different results. The disciples gathered around him on the shores of Galilee, watching as he painted this familiar picture that suddenly seemed pregnant with meaning they couldn't quite grasp. What strikes you immediately is the farmer's generous broadcasting technique. He doesn't carefully place each seed in optimal conditions. He scatters them everywhere, allowing them to land wherever they will. Some strategy, or is it? The farmer casts the same seed, identical in every way across his entire field, yet the results vary so dramatically you'd think he was planting different crops entirely. What emerges from this simple observation challenges everything we assume about spiritual success and failure. Watch what happens to that first handful of seeds. They hit the hardened pathway and simply lie there, exposed and vulnerable. Before they can even attempt to sprout, birds swoop down and devour them completely. Gone, no chance whatsoever. But here's something curious. The path didn't start out hard. Countless footsteps, wagon wheels, and animal hooves gradually compacted the soil until it became impenetrable. What was once soft earth, capable of receiving seed, became a surface so resistant that nothing could penetrate it. The second scattering lands among rocks with just a thin layer of soil on top. Perfect. The seeds sprout quickly in the shallow earth warmed by the stones beneath. For a brief moment, this appears to be the most successful soil of all. Rapid germination, enthusiastic growth, visible results. Then the sun grows hot, and everything changes. Without deep roots to reach moisture, the impressive sprouts wither and die. What looked like the best beginning becomes the most disappointing failure. The third handful falls among thorns, and something fascinating happens. Both the seed and the weeds grow together, sharing the same soil, drinking the same water, reaching for the same sunlight. But gradually, inevitably, the stronger plants choke out the weaker ones. The seed that seemed so promising gets strangled by competition it couldn't overcome. Finally, some seed finds prepared ground, soil that's been plowed, cleared of obstacles, ready to receive and nourish whatever's planted there. These seeds don't just survive, they flourish beyond all reasonable expectation, producing 30, 60, even 100-fold return. Same seed, 4 completely different outcomes. Jesus later explains that the seed represents God's word, consistent, unchanging, carrying the same life-giving potential regardless of where it lands. The variable isn't the seed, but the soil. And the soil represents the human heart in its various conditions of receptivity. Something profound emerges when you realize this isn't really about different people, but about the same heart at different seasons of life. We've all been each type of soil at various times, haven't we? Sometimes hard and resistant, sometimes enthusiastic but shallow, sometimes divided between competing loyalties, sometimes genuinely prepared to receive and nurture spiritual truth. The hardened path represents hearts that have become resistant through repeated exposure to spiritual truth without response. Each ignored invitation, each rejected opportunity, each hardened reaction creates more callousness until divine truth simply bounces off without any possibility of penetration. Rocky ground describes hearts that receive truth emotionally but never allow it to develop deep root systems in their thinking and character. The initial enthusiasm is genuine, but when pressure comes, there's no foundation strong enough to sustain spiritual life through difficulty. Thorny soil captures hearts divided between spiritual truth and worldly concerns. Both grow together for a while, but gradually the demands of materialism, pleasure, and social acceptance strangled the spiritual life that could have flourished under different conditions. Good ground represents hearts that have been prepared through life experience, discipline, and conscious choice to receive whatever God wants to plant there. These hearts don't just preserve spiritual truth, they multiply it in ways that exceed every human expectation. The beautiful mystery is that soil conditions can change. The path can be plowed, rocks can be removed, thorns can be uprooted, and ground can be prepared for unprecedented fruitfulness. What seems like permanent spiritual condition is actually temporary circumstance that can be transformed through divine grace and human cooperation. Perhaps that's why the farmer scattered seed so generously without trying to control where it landed. He understood something profound about the nature of spiritual influence. You can't predict which hearts are ready to receive, so you make truth available to everyone and trust the process of growth to reveal readiness over time. The parable ultimately reveals that God doesn't change his message based on our readiness. He broadcasts the same truth universally, but our receptivity determines our experience of that truth. The farmer doesn't plant different seeds for different soils. Instead, wise farmers work to transform their soil to receive seed more effectively. What emerges most beautifully is how this connects to the larger story of divine patience. A wise farmer doesn't abandon a field after one poor harvest. He works season after season to improve soil conditions, trusting that persistence will eventually yield the fruitfulness he's seeking. In the same way, divine love continues broadcasting truth into our lives, season after season, trusting that hearts will gradually become more receptive to the life-giving potential of His Word. The question isn't whether God's truth has power to transform, it's whether we're willing to become the kind of soil where that transformation can flourish without limitation. The night an enemy sowed chaos in paradise. The farmer wakes to perfect sunrise over his wheat field, anticipating another day of watching his careful planting flourish under favorable conditions. But as he surveys his crop, something stops him cold. Scattered throughout his beautiful wheat are plants that definitely don't belong there. Weeds that look suspiciously like wheat in their early stages, but somehow feel wrong. This isn't random weed growth. This is too systematic, too strategically distributed, too perfectly designed to cause maximum confusion and damage. Someone has deliberately sabotaged his field while his household slept. We find this unsettling story in Matthew 13:24-30. Where Jesus describes agricultural warfare that would have made every farmer's blood run cold. Someone's enemy had come under cover of darkness and planted seeds specifically chosen to mimic and compromise the legitimate harvest. This wasn't vandalism. It was calculated destruction disguised as natural growth. The servant's immediate reaction tells us everything about the situation's severity. "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" They know their master's work, recognize quality seed when they see it, and understand that this contamination isn't accidental. The master's reply confirms their worst fears. An enemy did this. Picture the workers' frustration as they realize the scope of the problem. These aren't ordinary weeds that could easily be identified and removed. These are darnel, plants so similar to wheat that even experienced farmers can't distinguish between them until harvest time. The enemy chose his weapon perfectly. But here's what makes the situation truly diabolical. By the time the difference becomes obvious, the root systems will be so intertwined that removing the weeds would destroy the wheat as well. The sabotage is designed not just to ruin the crop, but to make rescue impossible without collateral damage. "Should we go and pull up the weeds?" the servants asked, their voices probably tight with barely controlled anger. Everything in them wants immediate action, decisive intervention, quick separation of good from evil. It's the natural human response to corruption discovered among purity. But the master's answer transforms everything. "No, because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest." The wisdom of this restraint becomes clear when you understand what happens underground. Wheat and weeds, growing side by side from their earliest stages, develop intertwined root networks that become increasingly complex over time. What appears separate above ground is actually connected below the surface. Imagine the servant's internal struggle with this decision. Every day they tend the field, they see the weeds growing alongside the wheat, taking nutrients, occupying space, threatening the integrity of the harvest. Every instinct screams for immediate action, yet wisdom demands patient endurance. The master knows something his servants are still learning. Premature separation often destroys the very thing it seeks to protect. The timing of intervention matters as much as the intervention itself. Months pass. The field presents a complex picture of genuine crop and counterfeit growth sharing the same soil, receiving the same rain, reaching for the same sun. The same conditions that nourish authentic wheat also enable false wheat to flourish, a reality that seems cosmically unfair to anyone who believes in immediate justice. But gradually, as harvest approaches, the difference becomes unmistakable. True wheat bows its head heavy with grain, while the impostors stand tall and empty. Character that was hidden during the growing season finally reveals itself in the fruit produced. Then comes the master's final instruction. First collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat into my barn. Notice the careful sequence. Even at harvest time, preservation of the wheat takes priority over punishment of the weeds. The weeds are removed not in anger, but in surgical precision that protects every grain of authentic value. Jesus later explains that this field represents the world where authentic followers of God grow alongside those who merely appear religious. The harvest represents the end of the age when a true spiritual condition becomes fully evident and final separation becomes possible without destroying what God values. The parable reveals something profound about divine patience that often frustrates human desires for quick justice. What appears to be divine inaction is actually divine precision. allowing enough time for character to fully develop while protecting developing righteousness from premature exposure to judgment. The coexistence of good and evil in the world isn't evidence of divine weakness, but divine wisdom that values preservation over immediate perfection. The same soil that nourishes authentic faith also allows counterfeit religion to flourish. The same grace that enables true transformation also permits false profession to continue until final reality becomes undeniable. Perhaps most remarkably, this suggests that our ability to distinguish between authentic and counterfeit spirituality develops over time. The servants couldn't see the difference early in the growing season, but by harvest time, the distinction would be obvious to everyone. The farmer's patience becomes a window into God's heart, valuing the preservation of what's genuine more than the immediate elimination of what's false, trusting that time will reveal truth more clearly than premature judgment ever could. The first parallel emerges when we consider how good and evil often share the same soil in human hearts. The second parallel appears in communities where righteous and unrighteous people live intertwined lives, sharing families, workplaces, and friendships. The third parallel manifests in the reality that premature judgment often destroys the very thing it seeks to protect. This connects powerfully to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 7:1 about not judging, lest we be judged. The wheat and tears parable provides the agricultural reason behind this spiritual principle. We simply cannot see clearly enough to distinguish between authentic and counterfeit in the early stages of growth. The evidence becomes striking when we examine the harvest imagery. The Greek word for harvest is therismos, which implies not just reaping, but the entire process of gathering, separating, and storing. The master doesn't eliminate the separation process. He delays it until the proper time when distinction becomes unmistakable. Wait, because this reveals something even deeper about divine timing. The harvest represents a moment when inner reality becomes outwardly manifest. What was hidden in the root systems finally appears in the fruit. Character that was developing unseen suddenly becomes undeniable in the grain produced. In Matthew 13:39, Jesus explicitly states that the harvest is the end of the age. This connects the parable to cosmic realities, revealing that what appears to be a local farming issue actually represents the fundamental tension of human history. Good and evil coexist not because God lacks power to separate them, but because premature separation would destroy what he seeks to preserve. The bundling process described in verse 30 shows remarkable precision. First, collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat into my barn. The sequence matters. Even at harvest time, care is taken to preserve every grain of wheat. The weeds are removed not in anger, but in careful preservation of what has true value. This parable ultimately reveals that what looks like divine inaction is actually divine precision. The same soil that nourishes wheat also feeds tares. The same sun that ripens grain also develops weeds. The same rain that brings life to the authentic also enables the counterfeit to flourish. The theological implications are staggering. God's tolerance of evil isn't weakness or indifference. It's strategic patience that protects developing good. The coexistence of righteousness and wickedness serves the higher purpose of allowing authentic character to mature without premature exposure to judgment. Perhaps most remarkably, this parable suggests that even our ability to distinguish between good and evil develops over time. The servants couldn't see the difference early in the growing season, but by harvest time, the distinction would be obvious to everyone. Spiritual discernment itself requires maturation. This transforms how we view the mixed nature of our world. Instead of being frustrated by the coexistence of good and evil, we can understand it as evidence of divine wisdom that protects developing righteousness while allowing character to reach full expression. The farmer's patience becomes a window into the heart of God, who values preservation over premature perfection. The explosive power hidden in insignificance. Imagine holding something so small you can barely see it between your fingers, yet knowing it contains enough potential to transform an entire landscape. In the merchants of first-century Palestine, merchants sold mustard seeds by the thousands, each one tiny enough to slip through the smallest crack in a coin purse, seemingly worthless when considered individually. Everyone knows that big changes require big efforts, substantial resources, and dramatic interventions. We measure significance by scale, impact by magnitude, and success by obvious results. Yet Jesus chose to describe the kingdom of heaven using something almost invisible to the naked eye. The parable appears in Matthew 13:31-32, Mark 4:30-32, and Luke 13:18-19, where Jesus compares God's kingdom to a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, that grows into a tree so large that birds make nests in its branches. The image would have startled his audience, who expected kingdoms to be established through military might and political power. But there's something fascinating about this particular choice of seed. Jesus could have used an acorn, which grows into a mighty oak, or a cedar seed, which produces one of Palestine's most majestic trees. Instead, he chose mustard, a plant considered by many farmers to be barely controlled weeds, spreading aggressively once established. The Hebrew understanding of small here is koton, which doesn't just mean tiny in size, but insignificant in status. It's the same word used to describe David as the youngest son, the one overlooked when Samuel came to anoint Israel's next king. This connects the mustard seed to a pattern throughout Scripture, where God chooses the small to accomplish the great. Notice what happens to the seed in Jesus' telling. It doesn't just grow large, it provides shelter. The phrase, "birds of the air come and nest in its branches," echoes Old Testament imagery, where great kingdoms are described as trees offering refuge to many nations. Suddenly, this tiny seed becomes connected to cosmic purposes. The Aramaic word Jesus likely used for tree would have been ilana, which specifically refers to something that provides shelter and sustenance. The mustard plant, despite its humble origins, becomes a place of refuge and provision for creatures that can't create shelter for themselves. But here's what's remarkable about mustard plants. They grow incredibly fast and spread even faster. In Palestinian soil, a mustard seed could reach 8 to 10 feet in a single growing season. What starts as something nearly invisible becomes impossible to ignore in a matter of months. The first parallel emerges when we consider how authentic spiritual influence spreads organically rather than through force. The second parallel appears in the way small acts of kindness can transform entire communities over time. The third parallel manifests in how individual transformation, begun in secret, eventually provides refuge and inspiration for others. The Greek word for nests is kateskenos, which implies not just temporary resting, but permanent dwelling. The birds don't just visit the mustard tree, they make it their home, raise their young there, and find safety in its branches. This reveals something profound about the kingdom of heaven's impact. Wait, because this reveals something even more astonishing about divine strategy. God doesn't establish his kingdom through overwhelming displays of power that coerce submission, but through organic growth that attracts genuine participation. The birds choose to nest in the mustard tree because it provides what they need. The evidence becomes undeniable when we examine the spreading nature of mustard plants. Once established, they reseed themselves prolifically, creating new plants wherever conditions allow. The kingdom of heaven operates similarly. Each life transformed becomes a source of further transformation. In Luke's version, the detail emerges that the woman planted the seed in her garden. This isn't random wilderness growth, but intentional cultivation. The kingdom requires both divine potential and human cooperation, both supernatural power and natural stewardship. This connects powerfully to Jesus' later teaching about his followers being the light of the world and salt of the earth. Just as mustard seeds seem insignificant individually but transform landscapes collectively, Christians appear weak in worldly terms but exercise profound spiritual influence through accumulated faithfulness. The parable ultimately reveals that God's method of world transformation defies human expectations. Instead of conquering through might, the kingdom spreads through service. Instead of demanding attention, it earns recognition through beneficial impact. Instead of forcing compliance, it attracts willing participation. What's remarkable is how this principle applies to personal spiritual growth. The kingdom of heaven begins in our hearts as something almost imperceptible, a small change in perspective, a slight shift in priorities, a tiny increase in love. But given time and proper conditions, it transforms our entire inner landscape. The birds finding shelter reveal the ultimate purpose of kingdom growth, not personal aggrandizement, but becoming a source of refuge for others. The mustard tree doesn't grow large for its own sake, but to provide what the vulnerable desperately need. Perhaps most beautifully, this parable suggests that transformation is happening around us constantly, often in ways too small to notice initially. Every act of forgiveness, every moment of compassion, every choice to trust rather than fear plants seeds that will eventually provide shelter for others seeking hope. The secret agent of transformation, hidden in plain sight. Watch a baker at work in the early morning hours, kneading a small piece of fermented dough into a massive bowl of flour. The proportions seem absurd. This tiny portion of leaven somehow will transform 3 measures of meal, enough to feed 100 people. Yet within hours, what was dense and lifeless becomes light, aromatic, and nourishing. We might expect Jesus to compare the kingdom of heaven to something obviously powerful, lightning, earthquakes, or mighty armies. Instead, in Matthew 13:33 and Luke 13:20-21, he chooses yeast, something so small it's invisible to the naked eye, working through processes completely hidden from observation. The parable centers on a woman who takes leaven and hides it in 3 measures of flour until the whole batch is leavened. But there's something curious about the language Jesus uses. The word translated hides is the same Greek term used for burying treasure or concealing valuable things. This isn't casual mixing, it's strategic placement. But notice what's remarkable about the proportions. 3 measures of flour, approximately 50 pounds, represents an enormous amount of bread. This isn't a family meal, but a feast capable of feeding a multitude. Jesus is describing transformation on a scale that defies the apparent insignificance of the catalyst. The Hebrew concept of leaven carried complex symbolism in Jewish culture. While often associated with corruption, as in the leaven of the Pharisees, it was also essential for celebration. Unleavened bread was for emergencies, but leavened bread was for joy, hospitality, and abundance. Here's what's fascinating about the fermentation process. It's completely invisible, yet absolutely unstoppable once begun. You cannot see yeast working, cannot hear it, cannot force it to work faster, yet its effects eventually become undeniable throughout the entire batch of dough. The Aramaic understanding of whole suggests not just complete coverage, but total transformation of substance. The flour doesn't just get mixed with leaven, it becomes fundamentally different in texture, taste, and capability. What was merely meal becomes bread. What was lifeless becomes alive with potential. The first parallel emerges when we consider how authentic spiritual influence works from the inside out rather than through external pressure. The second parallel appears in the way small groups of committed believers can transform entire communities over time. The third parallel manifests in how personal character change, though invisible initially, eventually affects every aspect of life. But wait, because there's something even more profound about the timing. Leaven works according to its own schedule, influenced by temperature and moisture, but never hurried by human impatience. The transformation happens in God's timing, not ours, following natural laws that reflect spiritual principles. The Greek word for until suggests not just completion, but fullness. The leaven works until the entire batch reaches its intended potential. The kingdom of heaven doesn't partially transform lives or communities, it works until the full intention of divine love is realized. This connects powerfully to Jesus' teaching about abiding in him in John 15. Just as leaven must remain in contact with flour to effect transformation, spiritual influence requires ongoing connection with its source. Separation stops the process. Intimacy accelerates it. The evidence becomes remarkable when we consider the woman's role in the parable. She doesn't create the leaven, that already exists. She doesn't control the fermentation, that follows natural laws. But she does choose where to place the leaven and provides the conditions necessary for its work. The 3 measures of flour echo significant biblical patterns. Abraham prepared 3 measures for his heavenly visitors in Genesis 18. Hannah brought 3 measures as an offering in 1 Samuel 1. This isn't random quantity, but connects to moments when human hospitality encountered divine purpose. This reveals something stunning about kingdom methodology. God doesn't transform the world through overwhelming force, but through strategic placement of transforming agents in receptive environments. The leaven is small, but when properly positioned, it affects everything it touches. What's remarkable is how this principle applies to prayer, worship, and acts of love. These activities seem insignificant compared to the magnitude of problems they address, yet they work through hidden processes that eventually transform entire situations from within. The parable ultimately reveals that the kingdom of heaven operates through principles of organic transformation rather than mechanical change. Like leaven, it works through relationship, contact, and time, rather than force, coercion, or speed. Perhaps most beautifully, this suggests that our role in kingdom advancement isn't to create transformation, but to position ourselves where divine influence can work through us. We become the leaven when we allow God's love to so thoroughly permeate our lives that everywhere we go, transformation begins to happen naturally. The woman's confidence in placing such a small amount of leaven in such a large batch of flour reflects perfect understanding of the power at work. In the same way, we can trust that divine love, however small it appears in our circumstances, contains enough transforming potential to affect every aspect of reality it encounters. The life-altering moment when value reveals itself. Picture a hired laborer working another man's field under the scorching Palestinian sun, his hoe striking something hard beneath the surface. As he clears away the dirt, his breath catches buried treasure, more valuable than anything he's ever imagined. In that instant, everything changes. His priorities, his plans, his entire future suddenly revolves around one overwhelming reality. He must possess this field. We find this electrifying moment captured in just one verse, Matthew 13:44, where Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven as treasure hidden in a field. The man who discovers it immediately hides it again, goes away, sells everything he owns, and returns to buy the field with joy. But there's something fascinating about the setup of this parable. The man isn't searching for treasure, he's simply working. The discovery is completely unexpected, transforming an ordinary day into the most significant moment of his life. This suggests something profound about how divine revelation often comes to us. Notice the man's immediate reaction. He hides the treasure again. This wasn't selfish deception, but wise protection. He understood that premature disclosure could result in losing what he'd found. True spiritual discovery sometimes requires careful stewardship of timing and revelation. The Hebrew concept of treasure is matman, referring to something valuable that's been deliberately concealed for safekeeping. This wasn't accidentally lost property, but intentionally hidden wealth, stored by someone who planned to return but never did. The field contained more than its appearance suggested. But here's what's remarkable about the man's response. He sells everything he owns with joy. The text emphasizes his emotional state. This isn't grudging sacrifice, but celebration. When you truly understand the value of what you found, exchanging everything else becomes an act of wisdom, not loss. The Aramaic understanding of everything suggests not just material possessions, but entire ways of life, relationships, and identity. The man doesn't just liquidate assets, he reorients his entire existence around the treasure's value. This represents complete life transformation. The first parallel emerges when we consider how spiritual awakening often comes unexpectedly, disrupting ordinary routines with extraordinary revelation. The second parallel appears in the immediate recognition of supreme value that makes all other priorities suddenly secondary. The third parallel manifests in the joy that accompanies trading temporal security for eternal significance. But wait, because there's something even more intriguing about the economics of this transaction. The man pays for the entire field to obtain the treasure within it. He doesn't try to negotiate for just the treasure. He wants legitimate ownership of everything associated with his discovery. The Greek word for joy here is chara, which implies not just happiness, but deep satisfaction and celebration. This isn't the grim determination of duty, but the enthusiasm of someone who realizes they're making the best deal possible. True spiritual commitment feels like privilege, not sacrifice. This connects powerfully to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 6:21, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." The parable illustrates this principle in action. Once the man recognizes ultimate value, his heart automatically follows his treasure to its location. The evidence becomes striking when we examine the secrecy element. The man doesn't announce his discovery or seek validation from others. He acts decisively based on his own recognition of value. Authentic spiritual experience often requires personal conviction rather than crowd consensus. The field represents the context in which treasure is found, not just the specific location, but everything associated with discovering divine reality. When we find God, we don't just receive isolated benefits, but enter into a complete new realm of existence with all its privileges and responsibilities. This reveals something profound about the nature of spiritual economics. What appears to be total loss from one perspective becomes incredible gain from another. The man's friends might think he's crazy for selling everything for an unremarkable field, but he knows something they don't understand. The parable ultimately reveals that recognizing divine value creates immediate clarity about priorities. The man doesn't struggle with the decision, debate the wisdom of his choice, or negotiate partial commitment. When you see clearly, action becomes natural and joyful. What's remarkable is how this principle applies to everyday spiritual decisions. Every time we choose divine priorities over worldly advantages, we're making the same exchange the man made, trading what seems valuable from limited perspective for what has ultimate worth from eternal perspective. Perhaps most beautifully, the man's joy reveals something crucial about authentic spirituality. Following God isn't about grim duty or reluctant obedience, but about the celebration that comes from discovering life's greatest treasure. When we truly understand what we found in divine relationship, everything else becomes easy to release. When a lifetime of searching leads to one perfect discovery. Imagine a pearl merchant who has spent decades traveling trade routes, examining thousands of pearls, developing an expert eye for quality, luster, and value. His reputation depends on recognizing excellence, his livelihood on distinguishing the merely good from the truly exceptional. Then one day, he encounters a pearl so perfect, it redefines everything he thought he knew about beauty and worth. In Matthew 13:45-46, Jesus immediately follows the hidden treasure parable with another story about discovery, but this time the protagonist is actively searching. Unlike the laborer who stumbled upon treasure while working, this merchant has dedicated his life to finding exactly what he eventually discovers. But there's something intriguing about the contrast between these consecutive parables. The first man found treasure accidentally. The second found it through deliberate pursuit. This suggests that the kingdom of heaven reveals itself both to those who weren't seeking it and to those who have been searching for it all their lives. Notice the merchant's expertise. He's described as seeking fine pearls, indicating he already knows quality when he sees it. This isn't a novice making his first purchase, but a professional whose entire career has prepared him for this moment of recognition. His trained eye immediately identifies supreme value. The Greek word for fine is kalos, meaning not just beautiful, but beautiful with moral excellence, perfect in form and function. The merchant wasn't just collecting pretty objects, but pursuing aesthetic and ethical perfection. His search had both commercial and philosophical dimensions. But here's what's remarkable about pearls in ancient culture. They were formed through suffering. Unlike gems that were mined from the earth, pearls emerged from the pain of oysters responding to irritation. The most valuable treasures were born from the transformation of wounds into beauty. The Hebrew understanding of merchant suggests someone who travels extensively, crossing boundaries and cultures in pursuit of their goal. This merchant's search wasn't confined to familiar territory. He was willing to go anywhere, explore any market, examine any possibility in his quest for perfection. The first parallel emerges when we consider how some people spend their entire lives searching for meaning, truth, and purpose before encountering divine reality. The second parallel appears in how spiritual seekers often develop discernment through examining many alternatives before recognizing the authentic. The third parallel manifests in the immediate recognition when the genuine finally appears. But wait, because there's something even more significant about the merchant's response. Like the man who found hidden treasure, he sells everything he owns to purchase the pearl. But this decision carries different implications. He's not just acquiring something valuable, but ending his career as a pearl merchant. The Aramaic concept behind everything includes not just possessions, but professional identity, future earning potential, and social status. The merchant trades not only what he has, but who he has been, for the sake of possessing ultimate value. This connects powerfully to Jesus' later teaching about counting the cost of discipleship in Luke 14. The merchant's decision illustrates perfect cost-benefit analysis. When you truly understand what you're gaining, no price seems too high to pay. The evidence becomes striking when we examine the permanence of the decision. The man who found hidden treasure could theoretically return to treasure hunting, but the merchant who acquires the perfect pearl has no reason to continue searching. His quest is complete. The Greek word for sold is polē, which implies not hasty liquidation, but careful conversion of assets into the specific currency needed for purchase. The merchant doesn't panic or act impulsively. He systematically transforms everything he owns into the means to acquire what he most desires. This reveals something profound about spiritual conversion for those who have been searching for truth. The moment of recognition feels like the culmination of a lifetime of preparation rather than random discovery. Every previous experience contributed to developing the capacity to recognize ultimate value. The parable ultimately reveals that God honors both accidental discovery and deliberate seeking. Whether we stumble upon divine truth while living ordinary lives or encounter it through years of spiritual searching, the appropriate response remains the same: total commitment based on clear recognition of supreme value. What's remarkable is how this principle applies to different personality types and spiritual journeys. Some people find God suddenly and unexpectedly, while others discover Him through long processes of inquiry and exploration. Both paths lead to the same destination when pursued with authentic openness. Perhaps most beautifully, the merchant's willingness to end his searching reveals something crucial about authentic spiritual experience. When we find what our hearts have always been seeking, the searching itself becomes unnecessary. The quest concludes not in exhaustion, but in satisfaction. The pearl of great price is worth everything we've ever sought, and more than we ever imagined possible. When the sea gives up everything, and nothing remains hidden. Picture fishermen in the pre-dawn darkness on the Sea of Galilee, launching their dragnet, a massive seine that could stretch for hundreds of feet. Unlike other fishing methods that target specific types of fish, the dragnet captures everything in its path. As they slowly draw it to shore, the net bulges with an incredible variety of sea life, some valuable, some worthless, all caught together in the same sweep. In Matthew 13:47-50, Jesus concludes his series of kingdom parables with this image of ultimate comprehensiveness, followed by final discrimination. The kingdom of heaven is like a net that catches fish of every kind, which are later sorted by the fishermen on the shore. But there's something striking about this parable's position in Matthew's gospel. It immediately follows the stories of hidden treasure and precious pearls, parables about individual discovery and personal choice. Now Jesus shifts to cosmic scope, describing divine activity that encompasses everyone and everything. Notice the universality of the catch. The net gathers fish of every kind. The Greek phrase pantes genos suggests not just different species, but every possible category and quality. This isn't selective fishing, but comprehensive gathering that includes everything the sea contains. The Hebrew concept of sea in Jewish thought represented the realm of chaos, mystery, and the unknown. When Jesus speaks of a net cast into the sea, he's describing divine activity that reaches into the most uncertain and turbulent areas of human existence, drawing forth what has been hidden in the depths. But here's what's remarkable about dragnet fishing. The fishermen can't see what they're catching until they pull the net to shore. The sorting happens not during the catching, but after the gathering. This reveals something profound about divine timing and methodology. The Aramaic understanding of full suggests not just capacity, but completion of purpose. The net isn't pulled to shore when it becomes heavy, but when it has accomplished its intended work. Divine timing operates according to completeness rather than convenience. The first parallel emerges when we consider how God's invitation to spiritual life is extended universally rather than selectively. The second parallel appears in how communities of faith inevitably include people of varying spiritual maturity and authenticity. The third parallel manifests in the reality that final judgment involves distinction that can only be made with complete information. But wait, because there's something even more significant about the sorting process. The fishermen don't sort while the net is in the water. They wait until everything is safely on shore. Premature sorting would result in losing valuable fish and failing to complete the catch. The Greek words for good and bad fish carry implications beyond mere quality. Kalos suggests fish that are beautiful, useful, and appropriate for their purpose, while sapros indicates fish that are rotten, corrupted, or unsuitable for consumption. This echoes the earlier parable of wheat and tares, where premature separation would damage the crop. The dragnet story reinforces a profound truth. Sorting requires perfect timing and complete information. Consider the fishermen's expertise. Years of experience have taught them to distinguish between fish that appear similar but possess vastly different values. Some fish look impressive but spoil quickly. Others seem ordinary but provide excellent nourishment. This discernment comes not from hasty judgment, but from patient observation and accumulated wisdom. When Jesus explains that angels will separate the righteous from the wicked at the end of the age, he reveals something crucial. The sorting isn't done by human assessment, but by divine agents who see with perfect clarity. They distinguish accurately between authentic and counterfeit spirituality, between external appearance and internal reality. Here lies a beautiful paradox. Divine inclusivity and exclusivity operating simultaneously. The net gathers everyone without discrimination, yet the sorting happens according to spiritual reality rather than human credentials or social standing. Think about church communities and spiritual movements throughout history. God draws people from every conceivable background into environments where spiritual formation can occur. Mixed motives and varying levels of authenticity don't invalidate the gathering. They reflect the comprehensive nature of divine grace working among imperfect people. The fishermen's willingness to cast such an enormous net reveals their confidence in two things: the abundance of the sea and their ability to handle whatever they catch. In the same way, God's universal invitation reflects both infinite love and perfect wisdom about managing the complex results of grace extended without reservation. Those baskets holding the good fish represent more than temporary storage. They symbolize permanent security and lasting purpose. What proves valuable in the divine sorting process finds eternal protection. Meanwhile, what cannot be used isn't condemned for being caught, but simply acknowledged as unsuitable for the master's intended purposes. The parable leaves us contemplating our own condition when the final sorting comes. Are we becoming the kind of spiritual fish that brings nourishment to others? Are we developing authentic character that will prove valuable in eternity? Are we allowing God's grace to transform us into something useful for His kingdom purposes? The vast net continues its work, gathering from every corner of human experience, while we live in the tension between universal invitation and ultimate accountability. The same love that includes everyone in its sweep possesses the wisdom to make final distinctions based on what we truly become, not merely what we claim to be. What would you do if you owed someone 10,000 talents, roughly 340,000 years' worth of wages for the average worker? This wasn't a debt that could ever be repaid through normal means. It represented complete, hopeless, generational bondage. Yet in Matthew 18:21-35, Jesus tells of a king who chooses to forgive this impossible sum entirely, writing off what could never be recovered. The parable begins when Peter asks Jesus how often he should forgive someone who sins against him. Would 7 times be sufficient? Peter's question reveals his assumption that forgiveness has reasonable limits, that mercy should operate within boundaries of human logic and fairness. But Jesus responds with a story that shatters all conventional thinking about debt, forgiveness, and proportional justice. The numbers he uses aren't random. They're carefully chosen to create an impossible contrast that reveals something profound about divine mercy versus human stinginess. Notice the servant's initial response when called to account. He falls on his face and begs for patience, promising to pay back everything. This reveals both proper recognition of his desperate position and complete delusion about his ability to resolve it. 10,000 talents couldn't be repaid even if he worked multiple lifetimes. The Hebrew concept of talent as a measure of weight and value connected to the temple tax system that every Jewish listener would understand. Jesus is describing a debt equivalent to the entire annual tax revenue of several provinces, an amount so large it defies comprehension. But here's what's remarkable about the king's response. He doesn't just grant the extension the servant requests, he cancels the entire debt. The Greek word aphiemi means to release, dismiss, or send away completely. This isn't partial forgiveness or a payment plan, it's total liberation from an impossible burden. The Aramaic understanding of moved with compassion suggests not just emotional response, but action motivated by deep empathy. The king doesn't forgive reluctantly or conditionally, but with genuine care for his servant's welfare and that of his family. The first parallel emerges when we consider our spiritual debt to God, not minor infractions, but accumulated rebellion that could never be satisfied through human effort. The second parallel appears in how divine forgiveness operates completely outside the economics of human merit. The third parallel manifests in the expectation that forgiven people will extend similar mercy to others. But wait, because what happens next reveals the tragic irony at the heart of this parable. The same servant who was just forgiven an impossible debt immediately encounters a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii, about 4 months' wages, significant but entirely manageable. The contrast is deliberately shocking. The first debt was 600,000 times larger than the second. If the king could forgive millions, surely the servant could forgive hundreds. Yet instead of mercy, the forgiven servant demands immediate payment and shows no compassion when his debtor pleads for patience. The evidence becomes striking when we examine the language. The fellow servant's plea is identical to what the first servant said to the king. "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back." The same words that received total forgiveness now fall on deaf ears. The Greek word for seized suggests violent grabbing, while choked indicates physical assault. The forgiven servant doesn't just demand payment, he becomes abusive toward someone in the exact same position he was just rescued from. Forgotten mercy transforms into cruel demands. This connects powerfully to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 6:14-15 about forgiving others so that our Heavenly Father will forgive us. The parable illustrates this principle in action. Forgiveness received but not extended becomes forgiveness revoked. When other servants report the incident to the king, his response reveals something crucial about divine justice. The original forgiveness wasn't conditional upon future behavior, but maintaining that forgiveness requires extending similar mercy to others. The parable reveals that experiencing genuine forgiveness should transform how we relate to others' debts to us. When we truly understand the magnitude of what we've been forgiven, the offenses others commit against us appear manageable by comparison. What's remarkable is how this principle applies to everyday relationships. Every time someone hurts us, we face the choice of the forgiven servant. Will we remember our own need for mercy, or will we demand justice for others while expecting grace for ourselves? The king's final judgment, delivering the unforgiving servant to torturers until he pays everything, represents the self-imposed consequence of choosing conditional mercy. When we insist on strict justice for others, we forfeit the grace we desperately need for ourselves. Perhaps most soberly, this parable suggests that forgiveness isn't just an action, but a transformation of perspective. When we truly receive divine mercy, it changes how we see others' failures and our own responsibility to extend the same grace that saved us from impossible debt. A lawyer stands before Jesus, testing him with what seems like a straightforward question: "Who is my neighbor?" The inquiry appears academic, but it masks a deeper desire to justify limited love, to find boundaries for compassion, to discover how little care might be considered sufficient. What follows transforms not just the concept of neighborliness, but the very nature of human responsibility. In Luke 10:25-37, Jesus responds not with a definition, but with a story that would have shocked every person in his audience. He describes a man traveling the treacherous road from Jerusalem to Jericho, a route so dangerous it was known as the Way of Blood because of frequent robberies and violence. But there's something significant about Jesus choosing this particular road for his narrative. The descent from Jerusalem to Jericho represents not just geographical movement, but spiritual symbolism, traveling away from the holy city toward Gentile territory, from the presence of God toward secular concerns. The man falls among thieves who strip him, beat him, and leave him half dead beside the road. The Greek phrase, hemithanos, suggests not just serious injury, but someone hovering between life and death, unable to help himself, completely dependent on the mercy of others for survival. Notice who comes upon the scene first: a priest, someone whose entire vocation centers on serving God and representing divine compassion to the people. Yet when he sees the wounded man, he passes by on the other side of the road, avoiding even proximity to suffering. The Hebrew understanding of priest encompasses not just religious function, but moral responsibility. These were men specifically called to mediate between God and humanity, to demonstrate divine character through their actions. Their failure to help reveals how religious position can become disconnected from spiritual reality. Next comes a Levite, a member of the tribe set apart for temple service, someone whose daily work involved caring for the house of God. But like the priest, he looks at the wounded man and passes by on the other side of the road, choosing convenience over compassion. But here's what makes Jesus' story revolutionary. The third traveler is a Samaritan. To Jewish listeners, this represented the ultimate irony. Samaritans were despised as racial and religious half-breeds, considered enemies of pure Jewish faith and practice. Yet this despised outsider becomes the hero of the story. The first parallel emerges when we consider how religious position doesn't guarantee compassionate action. The second parallel appears in how people we might expect to be caring can become hardened by familiarity with suffering. The third parallel manifests in how those we consider unlikely sources of help often surprise us with extraordinary kindness. The Aramaic concept behind compassion involves not just emotional response, but visceral reaction, feeling another's pain in your own body. When the Samaritan sees the wounded man, he doesn't just feel sorry, he experiences the suffering as if it were his own. But wait, because notice the progression of the Samaritan's response. He doesn't just feel compassion, he acts on it immediately and thoroughly. He binds the wounds, pours oil and wine for healing, puts the man on his own animal, takes him to an inn, and pays for ongoing care. The evidence becomes remarkable when we examine the costliness of the Samaritan's compassion. This isn't token assistance, but comprehensive care that involves personal risk, significant expense, and ongoing commitment. He doesn't just help, he takes full responsibility for the wounded man's recovery. The oil and wine mentioned weren't random supplies, but specific medicines. Oil soothed and protected wounds, while wine served as an antiseptic. The Samaritan came prepared not just for travel, but for emergency medical care, suggesting a heart already oriented toward helping others. This connects powerfully to Jesus' great commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. The Samaritan demonstrates what this looks like practically, treating the stranger's needs with the same urgency and thoroughness he would want if he were lying wounded beside the road. When Jesus finishes the story, he reverses the lawyer's original question. Instead of asking, "Who is my neighbor?" he asks, "Which of these three proved to be a neighbor to the wounded man?" The shift is crucial, from identifying who deserves our help to identifying what kind of helper we choose to be. The parable reveals that neighborliness isn't determined by proximity, ethnicity, or social status, but by willingness to cross boundaries to care for those in need. The Samaritan becomes a neighbor not through geography, but through generosity. What's remarkable is how this principle challenges every form of prejudice and exclusivity. Race, religion, politics, and social status all become irrelevant when faced with human suffering. The only question that matters is whether we'll choose compassion or convenience. The inn represents the ongoing nature of true compassion. Not just emergency intervention, but sustained support until healing is complete. The Samaritan's promise to return and pay any additional costs reveals love that doesn't calculate limits or seek escape from responsibility. Perhaps most profoundly, this parable suggests that our capacity to love reveals more about our spiritual condition than our religious position ever could. The priest and Levite maintained their ceremonial purity, but lost their spiritual authenticity, while the despised Samaritan demonstrated the heart of God through radical compassion for a stranger in need. The desperate knock that wouldn't stop until love responded. Imagine the absolute embarrassment of having unexpected guests arrive after midnight, opening your cupboards to discover you have nothing to offer them, facing the social catastrophe of failing in basic hospitality. In Middle Eastern culture, this represents more than inconvenience. It's a crisis of honor, family reputation, and community standing that demands immediate resolution regardless of personal cost. In Luke 11:5-8, Jesus uses this scenario to teach about prayer, but the parable reveals layers of meaning about persistence, relationship, and the nature of divine responsiveness that transform how we understand both human need and heavenly provision. The story begins with an impossible situation. A friend arrives at midnight needing food, but the host has nothing to give. In Palestinian culture, hospitality wasn't optional courtesy, but sacred obligation. Failure to provide for guests brought shame not just on the host, but on his entire family and village. But there's something crucial about the timing Jesus chooses. Midnight represents the darkest hour, when normal resources are unavailable, when social conventions discourage requests, when people are least likely to be generous. Yet this is precisely when the need becomes urgent and unavoidable. Notice the man's response to his crisis. He doesn't accept defeat, make excuses, or try to minimize his friend's needs. Instead, he immediately thinks of someone who might have what he lacks. This reveals something profound about recognizing our limitations and knowing where to find help. The Hebrew concept of friend here carries implications of covenant relationship, mutual obligation, and shared responsibility. This isn't a casual acquaintance, but someone bound by bonds of loyalty and commitment. The man appeals not to charity, but to relationship. But here's what makes the story uncomfortable. The friend with bread is already in bed with his children. His door is locked, and responding to the request would disturb his entire household. Everything about the situation discourages cooperation, yet the desperate man continues knocking. The Aramaic understanding of persistence suggests not annoying repetition, but determined continuation despite obstacles. The man doesn't knock louder or become abusive. He simply refuses to accept no as a final answer when genuine need remains unmet. So he knocks again and again, not frantically, not angrily, but with the steady rhythm of someone who absolutely will not give up. Each knock says the same thing. I'm still here. The need is still real. The situation hasn't changed. Inside the house, we can imagine the friend's growing frustration. His children are stirring. His wife is questioning what's happening. The comfortable warmth of his bed is calling him back. Everything in him wants to ignore the persistent knocking and hope it goes away. But it doesn't go away. Here's what Jesus reveals about this midnight drama. The friend finally gets up, not because of their friendship, but because of the man's shameless persistence. The Greek word used here is anidia, meaning boldness that refuses to be embarrassed by social conventions when genuine need is at stake. Think about what's happening inside that house. With each knock, the friend realizes something uncomfortable. This man isn't going to quit. He's not going to slink away in shame. He's not going to accept no as a final answer when genuine need remains unmet. And the knocking will continue until the need is met. And suddenly, something shifts. The inconvenience of getting up becomes smaller than the certainty that sleep is impossible while the knocking continues. Rising to help becomes the path of least resistance, not to mention the right thing to do. The door creaks open. Light spills into the darkness. "Fine," he says, but there's something different in his voice now. Perhaps respect, perhaps recognition, perhaps the dawning realization that this kind of determination deserves a response. 3 loaves of bread change hands, problem solved, crisis averted, honor preserved. But here's what's truly remarkable about this story. Jesus uses it to teach us about prayer. He's saying that if a reluctant human friend will respond to persistent asking, how much more will our Heavenly Father respond to the desperate knocks of His children? The parable reveals that persistence in prayer isn't about wearing God down or changing His mind. It's about developing our character, clarifying our understanding of need, and demonstrating the kind of faith that simply will not accept no when it comes to spiritual necessities. Every time we continue praying despite apparent silence, we're like the man at midnight, refusing to accept that our situation is hopeless, believing that help exists even when doors seem locked, trusting that persistence will eventually meet with response. The friend who finally opened his door discovered something beautiful. Genuine need presented with shameless determination has a way of awakening generosity even in the most inconvenient circumstances. And we discover something even more beautiful. Our God never sleeps, never finds our requests inconvenient, and always has more than enough bread to meet every desperate knock at His door. The day everything changed, a master's trust and a servant's fear. The house buzzes with unusual activity. Servants scurry through corridors preparing for their master's departure. This isn't an ordinary business trip. Everyone senses something different in the air. The master has been making strange arrangements, having private conversations, settling affairs with an intensity that suggests this journey might change everything. Then comes the summons that 3 servants will never forget. In Matthew 25:14-30, Jesus unveils one of his most unsettling parables about a wealthy man who entrusts enormous sums to his servants before leaving on a long journey. But this isn't a simple story about wise investing. It's a revelation about character under pressure, about what happens when trust meets fear, about the terrifying and wonderful reality of divine expectations. Picture the first servant standing before his master, probably the head steward, experienced and proven reliable. Into his hands go 5 talents, not coins but talents, each representing about 20 years of wages for an ordinary worker. We're talking about generational wealth, the kind of money that could buy entire farms or fund major business ventures. The second servant receives 2 talents, still an incredible fortune, still more money than most people would see in several lifetimes. Both men understand the magnitude of what they're holding. This isn't petty cash for household expenses. This is serious capital that could build empires or destroy lives if handled poorly. But then comes the third servant, and something shifts in the atmosphere. 1 talent, still worth 20 years of wages, still more money than he could earn in decades of faithful service, but standing there between his colleagues with their 5 and 2 talents, that single talent might as well be burning his hands. The comparison is unavoidable. The sense of being trusted less is palpable. What happens next reveals everything about character, about how people respond when they're given more responsibility than they think they can handle, about the relationship between opportunity and fear. The master departs, and suddenly 3 servants face the same question with vastly different resources. What do you do when someone believes in you more than you believe in yourself? The first servant immediately goes to work. 5 talents become 10. The original investment doubles through careful trading, wise partnerships, calculated risks that pay off magnificently. When the master returns, he can present not just the original capital, but 100% growth. Success beyond expectation. The second servant follows the same pattern. 2 talents become 4. Same percentage growth, same commendation, same invitation into greater responsibility and deeper joy. The pattern is clear. Faithfulness is measured not by absolute results, but by proportional stewardship. But when the third servant approaches, everything changes. "Master," he begins, and you can hear the defensive edge in his voice, "I moo that you are a hard man, harvesting where you haven't sown and gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your talent in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." The master's response cuts through every excuse. "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I haven't sown and gather where I haven't scattered seed? Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest." Here's what's devastating about the servant's excuse. Even by his own assessment of the master's character, he chose the worst possible option. If the master truly was as demanding as he claimed, wouldn't that make preservation through burial even more foolish than attempting growth through investment? The parable reveals something profound about how fear distorts perception. The third servant's image of his master as harsh and unreasonable becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. By treating the master as unforgiving, he guarantees experiencing exactly the judgment he feared. But notice what the master doesn't say. He doesn't condemn the servant for lacking the skills of the others, doesn't criticize him for starting with less, doesn't compare his potential to his colleagues. The condemnation comes entirely from choosing fear over faith, preservation over risk, safety over growth. The final twist is brutal in its justice. The unused talent is taken away and given to the one who already has 10. To those who use what they're given, more will be entrusted. To those who waste opportunities through fear, even what they have will be removed. This parable ultimately reveals that divine trust isn't just about receiving gifts, it's about discovering what we are capable of becoming when we choose faith over fear, growth over preservation, action over paralysis. The Master's expectations aren't unreasonable demands, but invitations to discover our true potential through faithful stewardship of every opportunity we're given. The day a scoundrel became a genius. The summons arrives without warning. One moment, the manager is reviewing accounts in his comfortable office, enjoying the privileges of his position, managing vast estates with the casual authority of someone who has never questioned his security. The next moment, he's standing before his master, watching his entire world collapse in real time. "What is this I hear about you?" The master's voice cuts through the morning air like a blade. "Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." In Luke 16, 1-8, Jesus tells one of his most morally complex parables about a man who faces the ultimate career crisis, certain termination, public disgrace, and the terrifying prospect of starting over with nothing. But what makes this story remarkable isn't the manager's predicament, it's the brilliant, ethically questionable solution he devises in his final desperate hours. Picture the manager walking back to his office, his mind racing through impossible calculations. Accusations of waste and mismanagement are flying. His dismissal is inevitable, his reputation about to be destroyed. Soon everyone will know he's been fired. Who will hire a disgraced manager? Who will trust someone already proven unreliable? The panic must have been overwhelming. No severance package awaited him, no pension fund, no safety net of any kind. In that culture, a man without work was a man without dignity, without hope, without future. But then, in the midst of his crisis, something extraordinary happens. Desperation becomes the mother of innovation. "I know what I'll do," he says to himself, and you can almost see the light dawning in his eyes. "When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." What follows is either the most unethical scheme in biblical literature or one of the most brilliant strategic moves ever recorded. The manager begins calling in all his master's debtors, systematically reducing their obligations. The man who owes 100 measures of oil, sit down quickly and make it 50. The one who owes 100 measures of wheat, take your bill and make it 80. One by one, he slashes debts with surgical precision, not random amounts, but carefully calculated reductions that create maximum gratitude without destroying the master's wealth entirely. Each debtor leaves thinking he's received an incredible gift. Each transaction builds a network of people who will feel indebted to the manager's generosity. The beauty of the scheme is breathtaking in its audacity. The manager uses his final hours of authority to create a future for himself. When that authority disappears, he transforms his master's resources into personal goodwill, converts temporary power into lasting relationships, turns imminent disaster into long-term security. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that has puzzled readers for centuries. When the master discovers what his dishonest manager has done, he doesn't explode in rage, he doesn't call for legal action, he doesn't demand the stolen funds be recovered. Instead, he does something that defies every expectation. He praises the man for his shrewdness. Think about this for a moment. The master has been robbed by someone he trusted, cheated by an employee in his final hours of service, manipulated by a subordinate who used company resources for personal gain. Yet instead of condemnation, there's admiration. Why? Because the master recognizes something remarkable in the manager's actions. Faced with certain doom, the man didn't panic, didn't give up, didn't waste his remaining time in self-pity or denial. Instead, he assessed his situation with brutal honesty, identified his only remaining assets, and used them with strategic brilliance to secure his future. The manager understood something profound about human nature. People remember generosity more than they remember justice. Gratitude lasts longer than guilt, and relationships built through benefit create stronger bonds than relationships maintained through obligation. Jesus then makes a statement that has echoed through history. The people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Here's what's devastating about this observation. A dishonest manager facing career termination showed more strategic thinking about his future than most believers show about eternity. A man motivated purely for self-preservation demonstrated more wisdom about building lasting relationships than people who claim to understand divine love. The parable isn't endorsing dishonesty, it's exposing a tragic irony. If someone can be so clever about securing temporal advantage through questionable means, why aren't followers of God equally clever about securing eternal advantage through righteous means? The manager's genius lay in recognizing that his current position was temporary, but that relationships could be permanent. He used his fleeting authority to create lasting connections, transformed his master's wealth into personal security, and turned his final day of power into an investment in his powerless future. The application is staggering when you think about it. Every day we manage resources that ultimately belong to God: time, money, talents, opportunities, relationships. These are all temporary trusts that will someday be called to account. The question is, are we using them to build eternal relationships, or are we simply preserving our temporary comfort? The shrewd manager's desperation forced him to think beyond immediate circumstances to long-term consequences. Maybe that's exactly the kind of spiritual urgency Jesus wants to awaken in us. The recognition that our current positions are temporary, our resources are borrowed, and our future security depends entirely on how wisely we use what we've been entrusted with while we still have the authority to use it. The scoundrel became a genius the moment he stopped thinking about preservation and started thinking about transformation. In his crisis, he discovered a principle that followers of God should understand better than anyone. True security comes not from holding on to temporary power, but from using that power to build permanent relationships with those who will welcome us when our earthly management comes to an end. The night everything depended on what you brought. The excitement has been building for hours. 10 young women, dressed in their finest garments, gather in the warm glow of oil lamps as evening settles over the village. Tonight is the night. The bridegroom is coming to claim his bride, and they have the honor of being part of the wedding procession that will light his way through the darkness. But as the hours stretch on and midnight approaches, 5 of them begin to realize they've made a catastrophic mistake. In Matthew 25, 1-13, Jesus paints a picture of celebration that turns into tragedy, of preparation that reveals character, of a moment when past choices determine present possibilities. This isn't just a story about wedding customs. It's a revelation about the most important preparation any of us will ever make. Picture the scene as evening begins. All 10 virgins appear identical in their excitement and readiness. Their lamps are burning brightly, their dresses are perfect, their positions in the procession are secure. To any observer, they seem equally prepared for the night ahead, but appearances can be deceiving. 5 of the women had done something the others hadn't. They brought extra oil, not just enough for the expected time frame, but surplus for the unexpected delays. Flasks tucked away in their robes, additional fuel for whatever delays might come. The wise ones understood something crucial about wedding celebrations. They rarely go according to schedule. The other 5 had calculated differently. They brought exactly what they thought they'd need, enough oil for their lamps to burn brightly for the expected duration of the wait. Why carry extra weight? Why prepare for delays that might not happen? Their lamps looked just as bright as the others, their confidence just as strong. As the night deepens, conversation flows freely. Stories are shared, songs are sung, anticipation builds with each passing hour. The bridegroom is coming. Everyone knows it. Everyone feels it. Everyone is ready for the moment of his arrival. But midnight comes and goes. The oil burns steadily. The flames dance in the darkness, and still no sign of the bridegroom. Then, slowly, barely perceptibly at first, 5 of the lamps begin to flicker. The foolish virgins watch their flames growing smaller, weaker, more uncertain. They shake their lamps, adjust their wicks, try every trick they know to make their oil last longer. But mathematics is merciless, and preparation cannot be improvised in the moment of need. "Give us some of your oil," they plead to their companions. "Our lamps are going out." The request seems reasonable, even natural. After all, they're all part of the same celebration, all friends, all working toward the same goal. Surely sharing would be the kind, the generous, the loving thing to do. But the wise virgins face an impossible choice. They know something their friends haven't grasped. There isn't enough oil to share. If they divide their reserves, all 10 lamps will fail instead of just 5. Better that some light remains than that all light disappears. "No," they reply, and the word hangs in the darkness like a death sentence. "There may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." It's past midnight. The shops are closed. The vendors are asleep. The suggestion seems almost cruel in its impracticality, but it's the only option left for those who neglected to prepare when preparation was possible. The 5 foolish virgins disappear into the darkness, desperately searching for oil that cannot be found at such an hour. Their lamps flicker and die one by one until they're stumbling through the night, guided only by distant starlight and fading hope. And then, at the worst possible moment, it happens. "Here's the bridegroom! Come out to meet him!" The cry echoes through the village, piercing the night with excitement and urgency. The moment they've all been waiting for has finally arrived. The bridegroom is coming. The procession is forming. The celebration is beginning. 5 lamps blaze to life, their steady flames cutting through the darkness like beacons of joy. 5 young women take their places in the procession, their preparation now vindicated, their wisdom revealed. They light the way for the bridegroom as he moves toward his bride, their flames dancing with the rhythm of celebration. The wedding feast begins, the doors close, and the celebration reaches its crescendo. But 5 chairs remain empty. When the foolish virgins finally return, oil purchased at premium prices from reluctant midnight vendors, lamps hastily relit, hope desperately maintained, they find the feast in full swing and the doors barred shut. "Sir, sir," they call through the heavy wood, "open the door for us." The reply comes back with finality that chills the blood. "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you." They were part of the original group, friends of the bride, invited guests with every right to participate, but they missed the moment that mattered most. While they were searching for what they should have brought, the bridegroom arrived, and they weren't ready to receive him. The tragedy isn't that they lacked good intentions or genuine desire to participate. The tragedy is that they confused looking prepared with being prepared, assumed that last-minute improvisation could substitute for advanced planning, believed that shortcuts could replace the patient work of genuine readiness. The oil represents something that cannot be borrowed, shared, or quickly acquired when needed. It's the product of daily choices, consistent disciplines, gradual development of character and relationship. You can't get it from others when crisis comes, can't purchase it when opportunity arrives, can't fake it when testing reveals reality. The wise virgins weren't being selfish when they refused to share their oil. They were being realistic about the nature of spiritual preparation. Some things simply cannot be transferred from one person to another. Readiness for divine encounter is earned through personal investment over time, not through last-minute appeals to others' spiritual reserves. The parable ultimately reveals that there are moments in life when everything depends on what you brought with you before the moment arrived. All the regret in the world cannot substitute for preparation neglected. All the desperate seeking cannot replace the patient building of resources when building was possible. The question Jesus leaves echoing in the darkness is simple but sobering. When the most important moment of your life arrives, will your lamp still be burning bright? The woman who wore down stone with water. In the courthouse of a forgotten city, a judge sits behind his imposing bench, known throughout the region for two things: his complete lack of conscience and his absolute disregard for justice. He fears neither God nor man, cares nothing for truth or righteousness, and makes decisions based solely on personal advantage. His reputation is so corrupt that honest people avoid his court entirely unless they have absolutely no other choice. But today, standing before this monument to judicial corruption, is a woman who has run out of options. In Luke 18:1-8, Jesus tells what might be the most shocking story in all his parables, a tale of how persistent desperation can triumph over entrenched evil, how relentless pursuit of justice can wear down even the most hardened heart, how the weakest person in society can defeat the most powerful when armed with nothing but refusal to give up. The woman is a widow, which in that culture meant she was virtually powerless. No husband to advocate for her, no sons to protect her interests, no social connections to influence outcomes. She represents the bottom rung of society's ladder, the kind of person the corrupt judge normally dismisses without a second thought. But she has something precious, a legitimate grievance against an adversary who has wronged her, maybe stolen her property, maybe cheated her out of inheritance, maybe taken advantage of her vulnerable position. The details don't matter. What matters is that justice is on her side, even if power isn't. So she comes to court. "Grant me justice against my adversary," she pleads, standing before the judge's bench with nothing but her case and her courage. The judge barely looks up from his papers. Widows don't pay bribes. Widows don't have political connections. Widows don't matter to his career advancement or his bank account. Case dismissed, without consideration. But the next day, she's back. "Grant me justice against my adversary." Same request, same determination, same refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. The judge waves her away with growing irritation. Doesn't she understand how things work? Doesn't she know her place in the social order? Day 3, she returns. Day 4, still there. Week after week, month after month, she appears in his courtroom with the same unwavering demand. She becomes a fixture in the courthouse, a persistent reminder of unfinished business, an annoying constant in the judge's otherwise predictable world of corruption. Other cases come and go. Wealthy plaintiffs receive immediate hearings. Well-connected defendants get favorable rulings. Business proceeds as usual in this temple of legal prostitution, except for this one woman who simply will not disappear. The judge tries ignoring her. Doesn't work. He tries scheduling her for impossible times. She shows up anyway. He tries legal technicalities to dismiss her case. She finds ways around them. He tries intimidation, condescension, every trick in his considerable arsenal of judicial abuse. Nothing stops her. And slowly, something remarkable begins to happen in the judge's calcified heart. Not conscience, he's too far gone for that. Not compassion, he's incapable of genuine feeling for others. Not justice, he wouldn't recognize it if it bit him. Fear. Not fear of God or man, but fear of something far more immediate and practical. This woman is going to drive him absolutely insane if he doesn't give her what she wants. Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me. The word translated attack here literally means to give a black eye. This respected judge, this pillar of corrupt authority, this man who fears neither heaven nor earth, is actually worried that a powerless widow might physically assault him if he doesn't give her justice. It's almost comic in its reversal of expectation. The most powerful person in the legal system terrorized by the least powerful person in society. The corrupt official worn down by persistent honesty. The man who thought he controlled everything, discovering he can't control one determined woman who refuses to give up. So he grants her justice, not because it's right, not because he's reformed, not because he's found his conscience, but because living with her persistence has become more unbearable than doing the right thing. The widow wins not through power, but through persistence, not through influence, but through refusal to give up, not through corruption, but through the kind of stubborn integrity that ultimately proves stronger than any opposition. Then Jesus makes his point with devastating clarity. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. The logic is irrefutable. If an utterly corrupt judge will eventually respond to persistent pleading, how much more will a perfectly just God respond to the cries of his people? If selfish fear can motivate right action, how much more will divine love ensure proper response? But there's something even more profound here. The parable isn't just about God's willingness to answer prayer. It's about the kind of prayer that moves heaven. The widow's petition wasn't casual or convenient. It was desperate, persistent, unshakable. She didn't pray when she felt like it or when circumstances seemed favorable. She prayed with the consistency of someone whose life depended on the outcome. Her persistence revealed something crucial about the nature of her need. This wasn't a luxury she could live without. It was justice she couldn't survive without. Her refusal to give up demonstrated the authenticity of her desperation and the legitimacy of her cause. The judge's eventual capitulation reveals something beautiful about the power of righteous persistence. Even the most hardened opposition eventually yields to consistent, legitimate pressure. Evil may seem immovable, but it's actually quite fragile when faced with the relentless advance of truth and justice. The parable ultimately teaches us that prayer isn't about changing God's mind, but about aligning our hearts with his purposes and demonstrating through persistence that we truly believe he is both able and willing to act on behalf of justice. The widow didn't wear down an unwilling deity. She wore down the barriers of her own doubt and the resistance of evil until divine justice could flow freely. Her victory stands as eternal proof that when we persistently seek what God wants to give, nothing in heaven or earth can ultimately prevent us from receiving it. 2 men, 1 temple, 2 prayers, 1 revelation. The temple courts are busy this morning. filled with the usual mixture of worshippers coming to fulfill their religious obligations. Among the crowd, two men make their way toward the sacred spaces, each carrying the weight of his own story, each approaching God from a completely different universe of experience and expectation. One walks with the confident stride of someone who belongs here, whose presence commands respect, whose reputation precedes him through these holy corridors. The other shuffles forward reluctantly, every step an act of desperate courage, his very presence a scandal that makes other worshippers uncomfortable. In Luke 18:9-14, Jesus tells a story that would have shocked his original audience to their core, a tale of two prayers that reveal two hearts, two approaches to God that expose the difference between religion and relationship. Two men who leave the temple in completely opposite spiritual conditions from where they started. The first man is a Pharisee, a member of the most respected religious group in Jewish society. These are the men who have dedicated their lives to perfect observance of God's law, who fast twice a week when the law requires none, who give a tenth of everything when most people calculate their way around religious obligations. If anyone has earned the right to approach God with confidence, surely it's this man. He takes his position near the front of the temple, where his prayers will be visible to others, where his piety can serve as an example to lesser mortals, where his righteousness can shine like a beacon in the darkness of human mediocrity. His prayer begins with gratitude. God, I thank you. So far, so good. Gratitude is appropriate. Recognition of divine blessing is commendable. Thanksgiving sets the right tone for spiritual communication. But then the prayer takes a devastating turn, that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. In that moment, everything changes. What started as prayer to God becomes performance for humans. What began as thanksgiving transforms into comparison. What should have been worship becomes judgment. What could have been spiritual communion becomes social positioning. The Pharisee proceeds to list his spiritual accomplishments. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. Every statement is factually accurate. He does fast regularly. He does tithe faithfully. He does avoid the obvious sins that plague common people. By any external measure, he's an exemplary religious person. But something is catastrophically wrong with this prayer, something that transforms genuine spiritual disciplines into spiritual poison. Meanwhile, standing at the back of the temple, as far from the Holy of Holies as possible, while still being technically present, another man struggles with prayer of a completely different nature. This is a tax collector, a member of the most despised profession in Jewish society. These men collected taxes for the occupying Roman government, often enriching themselves through corruption and extortion. They were considered traitors to their own people, collaborators with the enemy, spiritual outcasts who had chosen money over integrity. Every person in the temple knows what he is, knows what he represents, knows he has no business being in this sacred space. His very presence is an affront to decent people, his approach to God an act of audacious presumption. But something has driven him here anyway, some crisis of conscience, some moment of recognition, some desperate realization that his life has become unbearable and only God can help him find a way forward. He can't even lift his eyes toward heaven. His head remains bowed. His posture speaks of crushing shame. His entire demeanor radiates the agony of someone who knows exactly what he is and exactly what he deserves. Then he does something that changes everything. He beats his breast and whispers 4 words that transform his entire relationship with the divine. God, have mercy on me, a sinner." No comparisons to others, no lists of religious achievements, no attempts to justify his position or negotiate his standing. Just naked honesty about his condition and desperate appeal for mercy he knows he doesn't deserve. Two prayers, completely different in content, tone, and spiritual reality. The Pharisee prayed to himself about God. The tax collector prayed to God about himself. The Pharisee used prayer to distance himself from others. The tax collector used prayer to bridge the distance between himself and God. The Pharisee's prayer was filled with pride disguised as gratitude. The tax collector's prayer was filled with humility disguised as nothing. It was pure, unvarnished recognition of need. Then Jesus delivers the shocking conclusion that would have left his audience speechless. "I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God." The tax collector, the traitor, the thief, the spiritual outcast, goes home in right relationship with God. The Pharisee, the religious leader, the moral exemplar, the spiritual giant, goes home unchanged, his prayers having accomplished nothing except to reveal the depth of his spiritual blindness. How is this possible? Because God isn't impressed by our righteousness compared to others. He's looking for our honesty about ourselves. Because divine mercy isn't earned through religious performance. It's received through humble recognition of need. Because justification isn't the reward for spiritual achievement, it's the gift given to spiritual bankruptcy that acknowledges its condition. The Pharisee's fatal error wasn't in being religious or moral or disciplined. His destruction came through using his genuine spiritual achievements as weapons against others and barriers between himself and God. His righteousness became self-righteousness the moment he used it for comparison rather than gratitude. The tax collector's transformation wasn't despite his sin, but because of his honesty about it. His prayer opened the door to divine mercy not by minimizing his failures, but by acknowledging them completely and casting himself entirely on God's grace. The parable reveals that the distance between heaven and earth isn't crossed by accumulating spiritual credits, but by recognizing our spiritual poverty. The tax collector understood something the Pharisee missed. God doesn't love us because we're good. We become good because God loves us. In the end, position in the temple meant nothing. Religious credentials counted for nothing. Social status carried no weight. Only the condition of the heart approaching God mattered. And the heart that knew its need found mercy, while the heart that knew its achievements found only emptiness. The temple steps looked the same as both men departed, but their eternal destinies had been determined by 4 simple words. God, have mercy on me. The tree that had everything except what mattered most. The vineyard owner stands among his vines in the warm morning light, surveying his property with the practiced eye of someone who has spent years cultivating the land. Row after row of healthy grapevines stretch across the hillsides, heavy with fruit, promising another abundant harvest. But in the center of it all, taking up prime real estate in the most fertile soil, stands a fig tree that has become the source of his growing frustration. 3 years, 3 full growing seasons, 3 times he has come looking for fruit and found nothing but leaves. In Luke 13:6-9, Jesus tells a deceptively simple story about agricultural expectations, divine patience, and the terrible possibility that grace might have limits. But this isn't really about farming. It's about the most sobering question any of us will ever face. What happens when God's patience runs out? Picture the scene as it unfolds year after year. Spring arrives and the fig tree responds beautifully to the warming weather. Its branches reach toward the sun, its leaves unfurl in magnificent green profusion, its trunk grows thicker and stronger. By every measure except the one that matters most, it's a picture of thriving plant life. But when fruit season comes, nothing. The owner approaches with basket in hand, expecting to harvest the sweet figs that should crown another successful growing season. Instead, he finds abundant foliage covering empty branches, a tree that has invested all its energy in looking productive while producing nothing of value. The first year, he's patient. Young trees sometimes take time to establish themselves. Perhaps next season will be different. The second year brings disappointment. The tree is bigger now, more established, clearly mature enough to bear fruit. Yet again, the harvest yields nothing but leaves. Concern begins to mix with frustration. But the third year changes everything. "Cut it down," the owner finally declares to his gardener. "Why should it use up the soil?" The words hang in the air like a death sentence. 3 years of patient waiting, 3 seasons of hoping for change, 3 harvests that yielded nothing but disappointment. Enough is enough. The tree is taking resources that could nourish productive plants, occupying space that could be used for fruitful purposes. The logic is unassailable. In a world of limited resources, why tolerate something that consumes without contributing? Why allow a barren tree to steal nutrients from productive vines? The decision to remove it isn't cruel, it's practical, even necessary for the health of the entire vineyard. But then the gardener speaks up with a request that changes everything. "Sir, leave it alone for 1 more year, and I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down." Notice what the gardener proposes, not just another year of passive waiting, but active intervention. He's willing to invest additional labor, to dig around the tree's roots, to apply precious fertilizer, to give it every possible advantage for fruitfulness. This isn't mere sentimentality or reluctance to accept failure. The gardener sees something the owner doesn't, potential that might be unlocked through intensive care, possibility that could emerge through focused attention, hope that could be realized through deliberate cultivation. But his offer comes with a crucial condition. This is the final opportunity. If extra care doesn't produce fruit, the tree will be removed without further discussion. Grace has limits, patience has boundaries, and even divine mercy operates within the framework of ultimate accountability. The parable reveals something profound about the nature of divine expectations. God doesn't demand immediate perfection, but he does expect eventual productivity. Like the vineyard owner, he's willing to wait, to provide resources, to create optimal conditions for growth. But his patience, while extraordinary, isn't infinite. The fig tree represents anyone who has received the advantages of spiritual cultivation: good soil, favorable conditions, adequate time, sufficient resources, yet remains unproductive in the ways that matter most. It's possible to look spiritually healthy while being spiritually barren, to appear to be thriving while producing nothing of value for God's kingdom. The owner's frustration reflects divine grief over wasted potential and squandered opportunity. When God plants us in favorable circumstances, surrounds us with spiritual nutrients, and provides time for development, he rightfully expects to see fruit that corresponds to the investment he's made in our lives. But the gardener's intervention reveals something beautiful about divine mercy operating through human intercession. Sometimes what looks like judgment is actually opportunity disguised as urgency. The threat of removal becomes the catalyst for intensive care that might finally produce the fruit that has been missing. Crisis becomes cultivation. Desperation becomes opportunity. The threat of judgment becomes the impetus for transformation. But the parable's most sobering element remains unchanged. This is the final chance. The gardener's mercy has limits. His patience has conditions. His willingness to intervene has boundaries. If intensive care doesn't produce fruit, the tree will be removed without further appeals or additional opportunities. The story ultimately confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. God's patience with our spiritual barrenness isn't indefinite. While He's extraordinarily gracious in giving us time and resources for growth, He's also ultimately committed to productivity and fruitfulness in His vineyard. The question echoing through every branch and leaf is simple but urgent. Are we producing fruit that corresponds to the care we have received? Are we contributing value that justifies the space we occupy? Are we growing in ways that honor the investment God has made in our spiritual development? The fig tree's fate hangs in the balance of one final growing season, one last opportunity to prove that divine patience hasn't been wasted, one ultimate chance to demonstrate that grace can indeed produce the transformation it was designed to accomplish. Time is running out, but time still remains. The question is, what we'll do with this most precious of all resources while it's still available to us? The farmer who discovered he wasn't in control. Dawn breaks over the Palestinian countryside as a farmer makes his way to the fields, sewing bag slung across his shoulder, hope carried in every handful of seed he casts across the prepared soil. The work is familiar, almost ritualistic in its ancient rhythm. Scatter the seed, trust the ground, wait for the harvest. It's the same pattern his father followed, and his father's father before him. But today, something about the process strikes him differently. As he watches the tiny seeds disappear into the dark earth, a question begins to form in his mind that will change how he thinks about farming forever. What exactly happens between planting and harvest? In Mark 4:26-29, Jesus tells one of his most mysterious parables, a story about a man who plants seed and then makes an astonishing discovery about the limits of human control and the reality of divine agency working beyond our understanding or manipulation. The farmer completes his planting and returns home satisfied with a job well done. The field looks neat and orderly, the soil properly prepared, the seed evenly distributed. By every measure he can control, he's done everything right. Now comes the waiting. That first night he sleeps peacefully, confident in his work. But beneath the surface of his carefully tended field, something mysterious begins to happen. Invisible to his eyes, beyond his observation, outside his ability to influence or accelerate, the seed begins to respond to forces he can't see or understand. Day follows night in endless succession. The farmer rises each morning, tends to other tasks, lives his life with the normal rhythms of work and rest. Occasionally he walks through the field, checking for signs of progress, but mostly he simply goes about his business, trusting in processes he doesn't fully comprehend. And then, one morning, it happens. Tiny green shoots pierce the surface of the soil like nature's exclamation points, announcing that something powerful has been working while he slept. The farmer stares in wonder at this daily miracle he's witnessed countless times, yet never stopped finding remarkable. Life emerging from apparent death, growth happening without his effort, transformation occurring beyond his control. But here's what strikes him most profoundly. He has no idea how it happened. He planted the seed, that much he controlled. He'll harvest the grain, that much he'll direct. But everything in between, everything that actually matters, everything that transforms dead seed into living plant, happens without his knowledge, beyond his influence, outside his ability to understand or manipulate. The seed sprouts by itself, automate in the Greek, automatically, spontaneously, by its own internal power. The farmer doesn't make it grow. He can't speed up the process, can't force the outcome, can't control the timing. He can only create conditions and then wait while forces beyond his comprehension do the work that actually matters. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. The progression is orderly, predictable in its stages, yet mysterious in its mechanism. The farmer can observe the sequence, but can't explain the power that drives it forward from one stage to the next. Night after night, the farmer sleeps while the transformation continues. Day after day, he tends to other matters, while the real work happens beneath the surface. Week after week, month after month, the crop develops according to its own internal schedule, following laws he didn't write and rhythms he can't alter. Then comes the moment he's been waiting for. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it because the harvest has come. Suddenly, he's back in control. His expertise matters again. His actions determine outcomes. The harvest requires his skill, his timing, his labor. But everything that made the harvest possible happened without him, through him perhaps, but never because of him. This parable reveals something profound about the kingdom of heaven that challenges our deepest assumptions about how spiritual transformation works. We plant seeds through acts of faith, prayer, witness, service, things we can control and for which we're responsible. We participate in harvest through obedience, worship, sharing the fruits of spiritual growth, activities that require our conscious engagement. But the actual growth, the real transformation, the mysterious process by which spiritual seed becomes spiritual fruit, happens through divine agency that works beyond our understanding and outside our control. We can't make ourselves grow spiritually, any more than a farmer can make grain grow physically. The farmer's confidence comes not from understanding the process, but from trusting it. He doesn't need to comprehend photosynthesis to benefit from it, doesn't need to direct cellular division to participate in it, doesn't need to control germination to rely on it. His role is to plant faithfully and harvest obediently while trusting the mysterious work that happens in between. This transforms how we approach spiritual development. Instead of frantically trying to force growth, manufacture maturity, or accelerate transformation, we learn to create proper conditions and then rest in confidence that divine power will do what only divine power can do. The sleeping farmer represents the rest that comes from understanding our role and God's role in spiritual transformation. We don't need to stay awake watching for growth, don't need to dig up seeds to check their progress, don't need to worry whether the process is working. Our part is faithfulness in planting and readiness for harvest. The automatic growth reveals that spiritual transformation has its own internal power, its own natural progression, its own perfect timing. Just as grain can't be rushed into ripeness, spiritual maturity can't be forced into premature expression. Both require patience that trusts the process, even when we can't see or understand what is happening. The ordered stages, stalk, head, kernel, remind us that spiritual growth follows predictable patterns even when the mechanism remains mysterious. There is a natural progression from initial sprouting to final maturity, and each stage has its own purpose in the overall development. The farmer's readiness for harvest teaches us to stay alert for the moments when spiritual fruit is ready to be gathered, when growth is complete enough to be useful, when transformation is mature enough to be shared with others. Perhaps most beautifully, this parable suggests that the most important work in our spiritual lives happens while we sleep, outside our conscious effort, beyond our anxious striving. God is always working, even when we're not aware of it, especially when we're finally relaxed enough to let Him work without our interference. The mystery isn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be trusted. The farmer who tries to understand everything will harvest nothing. The believer who learns to plant faithfully and rest confidently will discover that divine power can accomplish what human effort never could. The man who had everything except tomorrow. The harvest has exceeded every expectation. Standing at the edge of his fields, the wealthy landowner watches his workers bringing in crop after crop of grain, so much abundance that his existing storage facilities are completely overwhelmed. Wheat piles up in golden mountains, barley overflows from every available container, and still the harvest continues. This is the kind of problem every farmer dreams of having. Too much success to handle with current resources. But as he surveys his embarrassment of riches, a smile spreads across his face. He's just figured out how to turn this temporary inconvenience into permanent security. In Luke 12:16-21, Jesus tells a story about a man who had everything he thought he needed for happiness, except the one thing that actually mattered. It's a tale of perfect planning that leads to total disaster, of wisdom that proves to be foolishness, of security that evaporates in a single night. Picture the wealthy man's excitement as he calculates the value of his unexpected windfall. This isn't just a good year. This is a life-changing harvest that could set him up for decades of comfort and ease. While his neighbors worry about next season's weather and next year's prices, he'll be sitting on reserves that could last him the rest of his life. But first, he needs somewhere to store it all. "This is what I'll do," he says to himself, his mind racing with possibilities. "I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." The plan is flawless in its logic. Bigger barns mean more storage. More storage means greater security. Greater security means freedom from worry about the future. It's the kind of rational thinking that business schools teach and financial advisors recommend. He can already taste the retirement he's about to fund with this incredible harvest. No more early mornings checking the weather, no more sleepless nights worried about crop failures, no more anxiety about market prices or economic uncertainty. He's about to buy himself the one thing money actually can purchase: freedom from financial fear. The construction begins immediately. Workers tear down the old barns with enthusiasm, making room for the massive storage facilities that will house his newfound wealth. The sound of hammers and saws fills the air as his dream of security takes physical form. Every board laid, every wall raised, every roof beam positioned brings him closer to the comfortable future he's planning. But there's something he hasn't considered. Something that never enters his careful calculations, something that renders all his planning completely irrelevant. That very night, as he lies in bed, perhaps dreaming of his expanded barns and secured future, he receives a visitor he wasn't expecting. "You fool!" The voice cuts through his sleep like a blade. "This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" Death has come calling, and it doesn't care about his building permits, his storage capacity, or his retirement plans. In one terrifying moment, all his careful preparation becomes completely meaningless. The bigger barns will be built, but he won't be around to fill them. The grain will be stored, but someone else will eat it. The security he worked so hard to achieve will belong to heirs who didn't labor for it. The irony is devastating in its completeness. The man who planned so carefully for many years didn't plan at all for this night. The man who prepared so thoroughly for financial security made no preparation for eternal reality. The man who is so wise about earthly treasures was completely foolish about heavenly values. But the tragedy runs deeper than poor timing. The real foolishness wasn't in building bigger barns, it was building them for himself alone. Notice how his entire plan centers on personal comfort, individual security, private enjoyment. My barns, my grain, my soul. Every pronoun points inward, every plan serves self, every dream excludes others. Where in his calculations was consideration for the poor who could have been fed with his surplus? Where was thought for the community that could have benefited from his abundance? Where was recognition that his prosperity might have been intended not just for his security, but for others' survival? The wealthy man's folly wasn't having money, it was hoarding it. His mistake wasn't prosperity, it was making prosperity his purpose. His error wasn't planning for the future, it was planning a future that centered entirely on himself while ignoring both God and neighbor. Jesus concludes the parable with words that echo through every bank account and investment portfolio. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. The phrase rich toward God suggests wealth measured by different standards, treasures stored in different locations, security based on different foundations. Being rich toward God means using earthly resources to advance heavenly purposes, investing in relationships rather than just returns, storing treasures that death can't steal. The parable reveals that true security can't be built with bigger barns because the greatest threats to human well-being can't be solved by increased storage capacity. Death doesn't care about your financial portfolio. Judgment doesn't recognize earthly credentials. Eternity operates by completely different economics than time. But perhaps the most sobering aspect of the story is how reasonable the rich man's plan seemed. He wasn't plotting evil, wasn't cheating anyone, wasn't even being unusually greedy by the standards of his culture. He was simply doing what successful people do, planning for the future, securing his family's welfare, making wise use of expected prosperity. Yet something about his approach was so fundamentally wrong that God called him a fool and demanded his life that very night. The difference between wisdom and foolishness, between appropriate planning and destructive selfishness, lies not in having resources, but in how we view their purpose. Are we building bigger barns to hoard blessings, or are we expanding our capacity to share abundance with others? The wealthy man's final night on earth came not as punishment for his prosperity, but as judgment on his priorities. He had gained the whole world of security he craved, but lost his soul in the process. His bigger barns would outlast him, but his hoarded grain would feed others, and his carefully planned future would become someone else's inheritance. The last sound he heard wasn't the satisfaction of completed construction, but the sobering reality of divine assessment. You fool! All his wisdom had proven to be foolishness. All his security had proven to be illusion. All his planning had proven to be irrelevant to the one appointment that actually mattered. The question echoing through every dream of bigger barns is simple but eternal. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Two men, one gate, eternal consequences. Every morning the rich man's servants opened the ornate gate to his magnificent estate, revealing a view that perfectly captures the extremes of human existence. Inside the gate, marble floors, silk tapestries, tables groaning under the weight of exotic delicacies, rooms filled with the finest luxuries money can buy. Outside the gate, a beggar named Lazarus, covered in sores, too weak to move, surviving on scraps that fall from the rich man's table. The contrast couldn't be more stark, or the proximity more cruel. Separated by mere yards of physical space, but living in completely different universes of experience and opportunity. In Luke 16:19-31, Jesus tells one of his most haunting stories, a tale of reversed fortunes, ignored opportunities, and irreversible consequences that stretch beyond the grave. But this isn't just a story about wealth and poverty. It's a revelation about how our earthly choices create eternal realities, how proximity to need creates responsibility, and how death becomes the great revealer of life's true values. Picture the rich man's daily routine. He wakes in his comfortable bed, attended by servants who dress him in purple, the color of royalty, the fabric of extreme wealth. Fine linen, the softest and most expensive material available, touches his skin. His breakfast table displays foods that most people couldn't afford for special occasions, yet for him, it's just another ordinary morning. As he moves through his day, he passes the gate multiple times, coming and going, entering and exiting. He steps over or around the broken body of Lazarus with the casual indifference of someone who has learned to not see what he doesn't want to acknowledge. Lazarus has a name in this story, unusual for parables where characters are typically identified by role or relationship. The name means God helps. A bitter irony for someone whose experience seems to suggest divine abandonment, yet Jesus gives him this dignity of individual identity while leaving the rich man anonymous, known only by his wealth. The beggar's condition is described in devastating detail, covered with sores that the dogs come to lick, too weak to drive away the animals, longing to eat even the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table, but apparently receiving nothing. This isn't temporary hardship or temporary setback. This is grinding, dehumanizing poverty that has reduced a human being to something less than the dogs that show him more compassion than his wealthy neighbor. Day after day, month after month, year after year, this scene repeats itself. The rich man feasts while Lazarus starves, separated by a gate that might as well be the boundary between different worlds, yet they share the same air, live on the same street, exist in the same neighborhood. The rich man cannot claim ignorance of Lazarus's condition. It's literally at his doorstep. But then everything changes in a single moment that reverses their fortunes forever. Lazarus dies first, carried by angels to Abraham's side, a place of honor, comfort, and eternal security. The beggar who received no help on earth finds himself in the presence of the Father of faith, surrounded by the comfort he never experienced in life. The rich man also dies and suddenly discovers that death is not the great equalizer, but the great revealer. In Hades, in torment, he looks up and sees Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. The proximity that existed in life, the beggar at his gate, is replaced by an unbridgeable chasm in eternity. For the first time in the story, the rich man speaks, and his words reveal everything about his character. "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." Notice what's remarkable about this request. Even in eternal torment, even in desperate need, even in complete reversal of earthly positions, The rich man still thinks of Lazarus as someone who should serve him. He doesn't ask to go to Lazarus. He asks for Lazarus to come to him. He doesn't recognize the beggar as an equal. He still sees him as someone whose job is to meet his needs. Abraham's response reveals the terrible finality of choices made in life. Son, remember that in your lifetime, you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. The word remember cuts like a knife. The rich man is forced to recall his earthly life, to relive every moment he passed by Lazarus without helping, to reconsider every feast he enjoyed while his neighbor starved. Memory becomes torment, recollection becomes agony. But the rich man's response reveals he still doesn't understand the true nature of his failure. Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not also come to this place of torment. Again, he wants Lazarus to serve his interests. Again, he fails to recognize the beggar as a person deserving of dignity. Even his concern for his brothers reveals self-interest. He doesn't want them to join him in torment, not because he loves them, but because their presence would increase his own suffering. Abraham's final response exposes the real issue. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. When the rich man protests that they would repent if someone rose from the dead, Abraham delivers the crushing conclusion. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. The parable reveals that the rich man's problem wasn't lack of information, it was lack of compassion. He had access to scripture that commanded care for the poor, justice for the oppressed, mercy for the suffering. He knew what God required, but he chose comfort over compassion, luxury over love, self-indulgence over service. His brothers faced the same choice he faced, have access to the same revelation he ignored, encountered the same opportunities for mercy he refused. A resurrection wouldn't change their hearts any more than Scripture did. The problem isn't insufficient evidence, but insufficient love. The gate that separated the rich man from Lazarus in life became the chasm that separated them in eternity. The proximity that could have been an opportunity for mercy became evidence for judgment. The beggar's presence at his door wasn't an inconvenience to be ignored, but a test to be passed, and the rich man failed completely. Perhaps most soberly, the parable suggests that how we respond to the needy around us reveals our eternal destiny. The Lazaruses at our gates aren't interruptions to our comfort, they're opportunities for compassion that determine our future. The poverty we can relieve becomes the standard by which our prosperity will be judged. The rich man's torment isn't just punishment for his wealth. It's the natural consequence of a heart that learned to not see, not feel, not respond to suffering that was literally at his doorstep. He created his own hell by choosing to live in a world where other people's pain didn't matter. In the end, the gate that the rich man used to separate himself from Lazarus's need became the chasm that separated him from Lazarus's comfort. The distance he maintained in life became the distance that would define his eternity. The choice to not see, not care, not help became the choice that determined everything that followed. The question echoing through every gated community, every locked door, every turned-away glance is simple but eternal. Who is the Lazarus at your gate, and what are you going to do about him? The feast that changed guest lists forever. The preparations have been underway for weeks. In the kitchen of a wealthy estate, servants work frantically to prepare what promises to be the social event of the season. The finest meats roast slowly over carefully tended fires. Exotic spices from distant lands season elaborate dishes, and the best wine from private cellars is being brought up from storage. This isn't just a meal, it's a celebration worthy of royalty. The guest list reads like a who's who of local society. Important merchants, respected religious leaders, influential families. Everyone who matters has received an invitation to this magnificent feast. The host has spared no expense, hired extra servants, and planned every detail to ensure this will be a dinner party people will talk about for years. But as the afternoon sun begins to set and the appointed hour approaches, something goes terribly wrong. In Luke 14:15 through 24, Jesus tells a story that would have shocked his original audience, a tale of spurned invitations, insulted hosts, and a guest list that gets rewritten in the most unexpected way. This isn't just about party planning gone awry. It's a revelation about divine invitation, human response, and the stunning reality of who ends up at God's table. Picture the host's excitement as the final preparations are completed. Everything is perfect. The food is ready, the tables are set, the atmosphere is elegant and welcoming. The servants have been briefed on their duties, the wine has been properly aged, and every detail reflects the generous heart of someone who wants to share his abundance with others. The traditional protocol requires a two-part invitation process. First, invitations are sent out in advance, allowing guests to plan and prepare. Then, when everything is ready, servants are sent to announce that the feast is about to begin. It's an ancient courtesy that ensures guests arrive when the food is at its peak and the celebration can commence immediately. So the host sends his servant with the joyful announcement, "Come, for everything is now ready." But instead of the eager response he expects, the servant returns with news that changes everything. "Sir, they're not coming." The host can barely believe what he's hearing. How is this possible? These are people he's known for years, respected members of the community, individuals who should be honored to attend such a magnificent celebration. Yet one by one, they're declining the invitation with excuses that range from reasonable to ridiculous. The first guest claims he must go see a field he's just purchased. The explanation sounds plausible until you think about it. Who buys property without examining it first? And what could be so urgent about looking at a field that it can't wait until after dinner? The second guest insists he needs to test 5 yoke of oxen he's just bought. Again, the excuse seems reasonable on the surface, but falls apart under scrutiny. You don't buy livestock without testing them first, and you certainly don't test oxen in the dark after the sun goes down. The third guest at least offers an excuse that can't be rescheduled. He's just gotten married and can't come. While this might seem like the most legitimate reason, it's actually the most insulting in that culture, where wedding celebrations typically lasted for days, and where a truly important invitation could interrupt even honeymoon plans. The pattern becomes clear. These aren't genuine emergencies that prevent attendance. These are carefully crafted excuses that reveal something devastating about the guest's priorities. They're choosing property over relationship, business over fellowship, personal convenience over generous hospitality. The host's reaction is swift and decisive. Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. If the respected citizens won't appreciate the invitation, perhaps those who have never received such invitations will. If the well-fed won't come to feast, maybe the hungry will. If the socially prominent consider themselves too busy, perhaps the socially invisible will make themselves available. The servant hurries through the streets, extending invitations to people who can hardly believe what they're hearing. The poor, who worry about where their next meal will come from, suddenly find themselves invited to a banquet fit for kings. The disabled, who are often excluded from social gatherings, discover they're not just welcome, but specifically sought out. The marginalized, who usually watch celebrations from a distance, are personally escorted to places of honor. But when the servant returns, there's still room at the feast. "Master," he reports, "what you ordered has been done, but there is still room." The host's response reveals the depth of his determination to share his celebration. "Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full." Now the invitation expands beyond the town to the countryside, beyond the local poor to the traveling strangers, beyond even the marginalized residents to the complete outsiders. Servants are sent to highways and hedges, finding travelers, foreigners, people so far outside normal social circles that they wouldn't even know such a feast was happening. The word compel doesn't suggest force, but urgent persuasion. These people need to be convinced that the invitation is real, that they truly are welcome, that this isn't some cruel joke or case of mistaken identity. The servant must overcome their disbelief, their sense of unworthiness, their conviction that such invitations aren't meant for people like them. One by one, the unlikely guests arrive. The banquet hall fills with laughter and conversation as people who have never eaten such food, never experienced such hospitality, never been treated with such dignity, discover what it means to be truly welcomed at a feast of abundance. But the host isn't finished. His final declaration carries the weight of permanent policy change. "I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet." The original guest list has been permanently canceled. The people who spurn the invitation won't get another chance. Their excuses have been accepted as final answers. Their priorities have been noted and respected. Their absence has been filled by others who appreciate what they rejected. The parable reveals something profound about divine invitation and human response. God's kingdom operates like this generous host's banquet. The invitation is extended to those who seem most qualified and appropriate, but when they decline through indifference or competing priorities, the invitation doesn't disappear. It gets directed to those who recognize its value and respond with gratitude. The tragedy isn't that unworthy people are excluded from God's kingdom, but that people who consider themselves worthy exclude themselves through their response to divine invitation. The feast continues without them, not because God lacks mercy, but because they've chosen other priorities over divine fellowship. The guests who ultimately fill the banquet hall represent everyone who has been overlooked, undervalued, or excluded by human standards, but welcomed with joy at God's table. Their presence isn't second best or backup clan. It's the revelation of divine heart that finds greatest joy in lifting up those who have been cast down. Perhaps most remarkably, the parable suggests that social position, religious credentials, and cultural respectability mean nothing if they become barriers to accepting divine invitation. The poor, disabled, and marginalized prove more qualified for kingdom fellowship than the wealthy, healthy, and prominent, not because of their suffering, but because of their response. The feast that began with careful guest list planning ends with radical inclusivity based on one criterion: willingness to come when invited. The banquet hall that was prepared for the prominent fills with the humble. The celebration designed for the respected hosts the rejected, and the host who planned to honor the honored discovers his greatest joy in serving those the world considers least important. The question echoing through every declined invitation is simple but sobering. When God extends his invitation to the feast of his kingdom, What excuse will prove more compelling than the opportunity to dine at his table the day the foreman redefined justice? The sun has barely crested the horizon when the vineyard owner arrives at the marketplace, knowing that harvest season waits for no one. The grapes are at perfect ripeness, the weather forecast is uncertain, and every hour of delay could mean the difference between a profitable season and devastating loss. Workers cluster around the square, hoping for a day's employment, desperate for the wages that will feed their families. Leonor surveys the crowd and selects his crew, negotiating the standard rate, 1 denarius for a full day's work. It's fair wages for honest labor, enough to sustain a family for 1 day. The deal is struck, hands are shaken, and the first crew heads to the vineyard as the morning light grows stronger. But what happens next will challenge everything these workers think they know about fairness, justice, and the economics of grace. In Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16, Jesus tells one of his most provocative parables, a story that reveals how divine generosity operates by completely different principles than human fairness, how grace scandalizes those who think they understand justice, and how God's economy rewards need rather than merit. Picture the first workers striding toward the vineyard with the satisfaction of men who have secured employment for the day. They know what they'll earn, when they'll be paid, and how their labor will be valued. The agreement is clear, the terms are fair, and their families will eat tonight because of the work they're about to perform. But as the morning progresses and the owner assesses the scope of the harvest, he realizes he needs more help. The work is extensive, the timeline is tight, and success requires additional hands. So at 9 o'clock, he returns to the marketplace. More workers are waiting, the men who arrived too late for the first hiring or who have been passed over by other employers. You also go and work in my vineyard, the owner tells them, and I will pay you whatever is right. Notice the difference in the agreement. The first workers negotiated a specific wage. These workers are promised whatever is right. They're trusting the owner's sense of fairness, accepting his judgment about appropriate compensation, placing their economic security in his hands without detailed contractual protection. They head to the vineyard, grateful for the opportunity, hopeful about the compensation, willing to work hard for whatever the owner considers fair payment. But the story doesn't end there. At noon, the owner returns to the marketplace again. More workers, more need, same generous offer. You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. 9 hours remain in the workday, but these workers will labor for only 6 hours. Yet they receive the same promise of fair compensation. 3 o'clock brings another hiring. 6 hours of work remain, but new workers are still needed and still welcomed. Same invitation, same promise, same trust required from workers who understand they're entering the vineyard later than others, but hope for fair treatment based on their contribution. Then comes the most shocking hiring of all. At 5 o'clock, just 1 hour before the workday ends, the owner finds more workers still waiting in the marketplace. "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" he asks. Their response reveals the desperation behind their presence. "Because no one has hired us." These aren't lazy workers avoiding employment. They're unemployed workers who have stood in the marketplace all day, watching others get hired while they remain jobless, hoping against hope that someone might still need their labor despite the lateness of the hour. The owner's heart is moved by their situation. "You also go and work in my vineyard." 1 hour of work, 60 minutes of labor, barely enough time to learn the job, much less accomplish significant productivity. Yet they're hired with the same promise given to all the others, fair compensation for honest work. As the sun sets and the workday ends, the moment of truth arrives. "Call the workers and pay them their wages," the owner instructs his foreman, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first ones. The payment process begins with the workers who labored only 1 hour. The foreman reaches into the money bag and counts out their wages, 1 denarius, a full day's wage for 1 hour of work. The workers who started at 30 o'clock watch in amazement as they receive the same amount, 1 denarius. Same payment for 3 hours of work as for 1 hour of work. The noon workers, 1 denarius. The Y o'clock workers, 1 denarius. By the time the payment reaches the workers who labored all day in the blazing sun, their mathematical minds are racing with possibilities. If 1 hour of work earned a denarius, surely 12 hours of work will earn 12 denarius. Basic arithmetic demands proportional payment. But when their turn comes, they receive exactly what was promised, 1 denarius. The same wage as everyone else, regardless of hours worked, effort expended, or heat endured. Their reaction is immediate and explosive. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. The complaint reveals everything about human nature's approach to fairness. They're not upset about receiving less than promised. They got exactly what was agreed upon. They're upset about others receiving more than expected. Their anger isn't about their treatment, but about others' treatment. The owner's response cuts to the heart of the issue. I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give to the one who was hired last the same as I gave to you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Are you envious because I am generous? The vineyard owner reveals that he's operating by grace rather than merit, by need rather than achievement, by generosity rather than strict justice. The workers who labored 1 hour didn't earn a full day's wage. They received it as a gift that met their family's daily need for bread. But the all-day workers can't celebrate this generosity because they're too busy calculating what they think they deserve in comparison. Their sense of justice is offended by grace. It benefits others more than it benefits them. The parable exposes the dark side of merit-based thinking. It inevitably leads to resentment of grace extended to others. When we believe we've earned God's favor through our spiritual labor, we become bitter about His kindness to those who seem less deserving. The 1 hour workers represent everyone who encounters God's grace late in life. Deathbed conversions, last-minute repentances, 11th hour discoveries of divine love. Their brief service doesn't diminish their reward because the reward isn't based on duration of service, but on the generosity of the Master. The all-day workers represent those who have served God faithfully for years, but struggle with resentment when others receive grace that seems disproportionate to their effort. Their reward isn't diminished by others' blessing, but their joy is poisoned by comparison and calculation. The marketplace itself represents the world where God searches for workers, finds them at different times and stages of life, and extends the same invitation. You also go and work in my vineyard. Some respond early, others respond late, but all who respond receive more than they could ever earn. Perhaps most remarkably, the parable suggests that the first will be last and the last will be first, not in terms of reward, but in terms of attitude. Those who serve longest may become most resentful of grace, while those who serve shortest may remain most grateful for opportunity. The vineyard owner's generosity reveals God's heart. He pays according to need rather than merit, operates by grace rather than calculation, and finds joy in giving more than anyone deserves rather than exactly what anyone earns. The question echoing through every pay line is eternal. Will we rejoice in divine generosity that benefits others, or will we resent grace that doesn't seem to properly reward our superior effort? The wedding feast that taught a lesson about honor. The invitation arrives on elegant papyrus, sealed with expensive wax, delivered by a well-dressed servant who waits respectfully for a response. A prominent Pharisee is hosting a wedding feast, and the guest list includes the most important people in the community: religious leaders, wealthy merchants, respected elders. Everyone who matters has been invited to this celebration of social significance. As guests begin arriving at the elaborate venue, a fascinating drama unfolds that reveals everything about human nature, social positioning, and the difference between earthly honor and divine recognition. In Luke 14:7-11, Jesus observes a scene that plays out at every social gathering where status matters and seating arrangements communicate worth. But his response transforms a simple observation about party etiquette into a profound teaching about the nature of true honor and the dangerous illusion of self-promotion. Picture the scene as the invited guests arrive. Each person enters the banquet hall with careful awareness of their social position, their community standing, their right to recognition and respect. Eyes quickly scan the room, assessing who else has been invited, calculating relative importance, determining appropriate seating based on perceived hierarchy. The seating arrangement at ancient banquets wasn't casual, it was a carefully orchestrated display of social status. The closer to the host, the greater the honor. The more prominent the position, the higher the recognition. Where you sat communicated not just your importance to the host, but your standing in the entire community. Jesus watches as guests navigate this delicate social dance, each person making calculated decisions about where to position themselves. Some boldly claim seats of honor, confident in their right to recognition. Others hesitate, uncertain about their appropriate place in the social order. A few hover near the entrance, waiting to see where others sit before making their own move. But then Jesus notices something that transforms his observation into a teaching moment. The subtle but unmistakable scramble for the best seats, the careful maneuvering for positions of prominence, the assumption that honor can be claimed rather than received. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, Jesus says, his voice carrying the authority of someone who sees beneath surface behaviors to underlying motivations, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. The scenario he describes would have made every listener's stomach clench with recognition. Imagine boldly claiming a seat of honor, settling in with satisfaction, perhaps even enjoying the envious glances of those seated in less prestigious positions, only to have the host approach with an embarrassed expression and uncomfortable news. "Friend, I'm sorry, but this seat is reserved." Every person present would remember this moment of public embarrassment. The attempt to claim honor would result in public shame. The grab for recognition would end in social disgrace. But Jesus offers an alternative strategy that seems counterintuitive, but proves to be profoundly wise. When you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. Picture this alternative scenario. You arrive at the feast and deliberately choose a seat far from the positions of prominence, content to occupy a place that clearly communicates humility rather than presumption. Other guests might wonder about your choice, perhaps even feel sorry for your apparent lack of confidence or social standing. But then the host approaches, not with embarrassment, but with pleasure, not to demote, but to promote. "My friend, what are you doing way down here? Please come sit closer to me where you belong." The promotion is public. The honor is witnessed by everyone. The recognition comes not through self-assertion, but through the host's initiative. Instead of claiming a position you might not deserve, you receive a position the host wants to give you. The principle Jesus articulates cuts through every attempt at self-promotion with surgical precision. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted by the one whose opinion ultimately matters most. The wedding feast becomes a metaphor for every situation where human worth is assessed and recognition is distributed. In families, workplaces, communities, and churches, the same dynamics play out daily. People position themselves for advancement, campaign for recognition, and angle for honor through various forms of self-promotion. But Jesus reveals that this approach is not only spiritually bankrupt, but practically counterproductive. Those who grasp for honor often find it slipping through their fingers, while those who serve without seeking recognition frequently discover